I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
And we are two nerds who are here to make Shakespeare easier to understand.
In this podcast, we will explore as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which the plays were written, and how his plays are viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as theater makers, how his plays can be responsibly performed today, all while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to Bardolatry.
So, Shakespeare anyone?
Hi, listeners. Want to support Shakespeare Anyone? Visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. Now, onto the episode. Hold on, I spilled water on me. I think I'm okay now. Hi, Elyse.
Hi, Kourtney.
How's it going?
It's going pretty well. How are you?
I'm also doing well. What was that?
Did you hear that?
Yes.
Remember the button that I said I forgot to turn on last time?
Yes.
That was me going, oh no, it's not on. I should turn it on.
Gotcha.
I didn't know you would hear it though.
I did hear it.
Well, we could start again.
No. I love it. We've got me spilling water on myself before recording. We've got you turning on a button and it making a loud noise.
Oh my gosh.
You know that we're going to be getting into something very chaotic and catastrophic and very monumental.
Something that changed the course of history.
Absolutely. The thing that changed the course of history that we are talking about today is the assassination of Julius Caesar. And we're going to look at some historicism regarding that historical event, maybe through a lens that you wouldn't get in your high school classroom if you are reading Julius Caesar. Maybe you will, depending on how maybe progressive your teacher is.
The people's history of the assassination of Julius Caesar.
But first,
we have some housekeeping to do. First up, we have some new Patreon patrons to welcome to our Patreon and give a big thank you for their support, because our podcast is entirely listener supported. And as an independent podcast, our Patreon patrons help us do the work that we do. So thanks, and ever thanks to
Ellen H.
and Jennifer John Grego.
Thank you so much for supporting our work through Patreon. We are so happy to have you in our Patreon community. Again, thank you.
And because of the support of patrons like Jennifer and Ellen, we have an exciting announcement to share with you, our podcast listeners. Drum roll. I wish I could do like a drum roll sound.
You know what? Maybe editing Kourtney will input a drum roll. We'll see.
Yeah, okay. Because of their support of our work, we have been able to commit to the quality of our work, and that has led to us being the recipients of the 2026 Shakespeare Association of America Shakespeare Publics Award. The Shakespeare Association of America Shakespeare Publics Award recognizes pioneering and/or culturally significant efforts to foster, engage, support, and sustain broad and diverse Shakespeare publics through teaching, scholarship, performance, and/or activism. We're also incredibly grateful to you, our listeners, to every listener who has rated, reviewed the podcast, shared it with a friend, anything that we have asked you to do at the top of the show or at the end of the show to support the podcast. Thank you for your support, and please know that we share this award with you as well. This is huge for us. We kind of can't believe that we are now an award-winning podcast and award-winning Shakespeare scholars in our own rights. We had a live on our Patreon where we talked about how we found out about this award, what we are hopeful for in the future that this brings, and a whole bunch of other stuff. We had that exclusive live with our Patreon patrons, but if you want to hear about that, you can join Patreon now and get access to the replay. Head on over to Patreon, one more time, to support the work that we do and get to hear a little bit more about what this award means to us as human beings and also for the future of Shakespeare Anyone.
Yeah, thank you. It truly is such a meaningful award. So thank you, everyone, for helping to support the podcast and get us here. And cheers to many more years of this crazy thing called being a podcaster and an independent Shakespeare scholar.
And now let's dive into the people's history of the assassination of Julius Caesar. So first, Kourtney, you have a bunch of research to share with us, but we wanted to start off by talking about sort of what our pre-existing knowledge of this event was, especially if you're not somebody who thinks about the Roman Empire every day.
Yeah, I'd say my Roman Empire is not thinking about the Roman Empire every single day.
My Roman Empire is obviously Shakespeare, so
Unfortunately, it's a little adjacent.
Adjacent, but yeah, I think the last time that I really engaged with the assassination of Julius Caesar was when I worked on the play, but also when I learned about ancient Rome in school. You know, I know that he was stabbed 33 times in the year 44 BCE at the Senate, that he almost didn't go, and that he was warned to not go, that like the soothsayer is not like 100% beware the Ides of March, but that it was like beware the next like month or so, it's gonna be a bad time. And that's sort of what's really stuck for me from like history class when I encountered ancient Rome. What about you?
I think that's likely similar. I don't have many recollections of what I learned in my history class, my world history class about Caesar. Probably the similar tenets from the similar textbook that we probably had in our education system. And then the other pieces that I knew about Julius Caesar were from the Shakespeare play about Brutus and Cassius and Caesar and this idea of like, what does it mean to be a good ruler or a tyrant? That kind of moral question about what the conspirators did. And then also the title character of the play dies so early on. So the play is about Julius Caesar, but it's also not about Julius Caesar.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of gaps in my knowledge about what actually happened historically. And so, yeah, for me, there's a lot of pieces I don't know about.
Yeah.
And a lot of my knowledge is based on this play. And I would guess that many people also have a similar experience where it's like very, maybe a paragraph here in a textbook and
Yeah.
a depiction of Caesar in a film or a Shakespeare play or reading this play. So that's where I was at. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of the play, when I did the play the first time, which was the first time I encountered the play, I remember being just like struck by what I found to be a central theme, which was who gets to tell our history and how is history written? Because I was so enthralled by how Shakespeare didn't really like make an argument, at least in my like 16-year-old brain, didn't really find that like Shakespeare made a strong argument to like which side we should root for. It was like, yeah, like Brutus and Cassius have their problems, they're not perfect, and Mark Antony and Octavius also not perfect. So I remember just being struck by like, like who gets to walk away and say that like this was a tragic event? The winners. But who gets to tell our story? And I think that is a question that you might be able to speak to a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. The research that I did for this episode is really based in that question, that critical question of like, who tells the story? Why did they get to tell the story? And then what kind of effect does it have for us moving forward based on like the victors or whoever the storyteller is? Because one thing that now that I'm rethinking, one thing that struck me as well about the play, Shakespeare's play, is the fact that there are all these reasons why Caesar should not be a ruler, but they are all so non-specific. And some of them are based on what ifs. And so my question is, why did the conspirators choose to assassinate Caesar? Why did the late Republic end up having another civil war? And what were the actual tangible reasons for this event? And for this episode, I went to a really good source for these types of questions. My reading comes from The Assassination of Julius Caesar by Michael Parenti. It is his 2003 publication. I did not read the entire book. I was planning on reading the entire book, but life gets in the way. but I did read the introduction, chapter 9, which is about the assassination, and I watched a lecture about the assassination of Julius Caesar that Parenti gave on April 6th, 1998, at the University of Washington in Seattle, and it is on YouTube. And Parenti is a fantastic lecturer. And there is a running theme in Parenti's work about class interest and looking at history through a class lens. And so that is really what this research is based on. And I do also want to share that Michael Parenti died just this year, January 24th of this year, aged 92. He has a great amount of work that he has left with us, but earlier this year he did pass. So we know the basics about the assassination of Julius Caesar. We know that it took place on March 15th in 44 BCE. We know that the Roman senators waited on the arrival of the Republic's supreme commander, Julius Caesar. Like you said, we know that Caesar entered a chamber and a meeting hall adjacent to Pompey's theater. We knew that Julius Caesar was at the height of his power, and we knew that the first senator to approach him pretended to enter a personal plea on behalf of a relative, and then behind him, a group of other senators crowded around the chair and began to slash at their prey with their knives, delivering fatal wounds. And the assailants believed that they had saved the Roman Republic, but as we know from history and from Shakespeare's play, as Parenti says, they set the stage for its undoing. And in this book, Michael Parenti asks, why did a coterie of Roman senators assassinate their fellow aristocrat and celebrated ruler, Julius Caesar? Parenti is exploring, why did this assassination happen in the first place? And the book explores political rule, class power, and a people's struggle for democracy and social justice. It also set into motion a civil war and a subsequent absolutist war. One thing that Parenti does that I really enjoy reading about is he looks critically, as you're saying, at who tells the story, why they're telling the story. So while ancient and modern historians, as well as Caesar's assassins, explain that this act was a way to restore Republican liberties by doing away with the usurper, Parenti offers an alternative explanation. Parenti posits that the Senate aristocrats killed Caesar because they perceived him to be a popular leader who threatened their privileged interests. So the act of assassinating Julius Caesar was treason, not tyrannicide. And Parenti also, through his research, looks at the material interests surrounding class interests and the anxieties in Rome with wealthy Romans hating and fearing the common people, as well as anyone who infringed upon their class interests. And the late Republic in Rome is a time where Roman politics was becoming more democratized, and the oligarchs of Rome, the aristocrats of Rome, parentheses, were inhospitable to Rome's democratic element, and they valued the Republic only as long as it served their way of life. So Caesar's sin, Parenti argues, quote, was not that he was subverting the Roman constitution, which was an unwritten one, but that he was loosening the oligarchy's overbearing grip on it, unquote. And so Caesar, and I'll talk about this more in detail, when he was the consul, when he was the dictator, he used state power to give limited but still present benefits to small farmers, debtors, the urban working class, at the expense of the wealthy aristocrats who would be in the Senate. And these reforms would have been unforgivable to the senators. And the reason that Parenti wrote this book, I think, is really interesting because I think it mirrors our experience and our own education about Julius Caesar and the assassination of Julius Caesar. So Parenti owes his initial and very limited knowledge of Julius Caesar to two playwrights. The first is William Shakespeare, and the second is George Bernard Shaw. Parenti, in exploring the assassination of Julius Caesar, wanted to monitor our tendency as people to treat the fictional as factual. And so one thing that Parenti notes is that Shakespeare does pull from Plutarch very faithfully. However, the ambiguities presented, like who is good and who is bad, who is right and who is wrong, Caesar, Brutus, Antony, all of this makes Shakespeare's treatment of Julius Caesar, according to Parenti, a, quote, politically safe rendition, unquote. And I feel like we might get into that more when we do some research about early modern England and their thoughts about Rome, ancient Rome, and the late Republic. But I think that's really interesting because Shakespeare focuses on that question of tyranny versus Republican freedom. Shakespeare's representation of the common people is also that the people are a crowd, quote, easily led hither and thither, first adulating Pompey, then bowing to Caesar, later hailing Brutus for saving them from tyranny, only in the next breath to be swayed by Antony, unquote. And then they're also a group of people who are led to mindless violence. Like Shakespeare's rendition seems to, in some ways, avoid the class interests that Plutarch had written about.
Yeah, I mean, which also it tracks with like what Shakespeare writes about and what we know about like what he had to do to get things on the stage, to get things past the censorship. He couldn't write something that was pro overthrowing somebody, overthrowing your leader with the authoritarian monarchy that he was living under, right? Yet he, is exploring like, can we tell who was right in this? Like, can we tell like which side we should have been on? And that's kind of as far as he can push that envelope if he's trying to. We were kind of talking about this offline earlier today before we started recording. He not only explores these themes throughout other plays, but they sort of echo a lot of the politics of the world that Shakespeare was existing in, where he has this like monarch and there's this aristocracy who is leading the country and has their interests that are not the same as the cities, not the same as the working people. But thinking about Essex and how he was not really interested in being a courtier and thought that like he could do a better job just going out and doing war and colonialism for Elizabeth versus some of his rivals who were trying to govern the people most efficiently and trying to be the best governors of the people that they could. It's interesting that like Parenti is picking up on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you are right. Like it would have been dangerous for Shakespeare to speak into these things within his own play. And we'll talk more about that. We'll put a pin in that for next time. But the thing that I think is so fascinating is what Parenti said. Sometimes the fictional becomes the factual. And so what I want to do is rather than sit in the fictional of Shakespeare, I want to present to you the historical context and also some analysis of the late Roman Republic and look at the assassination from the perspective of this historical context and the class interests of that time period with the senators and Caesar the consul and the people, and really create a more expansive understanding of like the conditions of the time, and maybe answer some questions about why might the senators and the conspirators decided to assassinate Julius Caesar. Is it just because he may be a tyrant, or is there something a little bit more substantial there that could explain possibly why something so history changing as assassinating Julius Caesar took place back in 44 BCE? The late Roman Republic was a time period in ancient Rome from about 133 BCE to 44 BCE. And you mentioned earlier about like who gets to choose who tells history, who gets to choose the story. And Parenti indicates that history is written from the perspective of the winners. And oftentimes it's a quote unquote gentleman's history. So history written by scholars and historians who are a part of an aristocratic class. They have access to the best schools, the brightest schools. They are in institutions. And so
For the majority of time, they're the ones who can read and write down a history.
Exactly. And so we are getting the winners, and we're also getting gentlemen historians who are continuing to tell those stories. And just a kind of high level about the late Republic, or I guess really the Roman Republic. The monarchy in ancient Rome was overthrown around 510 to 509 BCE, and a republic was created. And a republic is a state in which political power rests with the public, the people, typically through their representatives. Though there were annual elections, the republican system was an elective oligarchy, not a democracy, with a number of powerful families largely monopolizing the senior magistracies. And a magistrate was an elected official. After the overthrow of the monarchy, there's this republic, and there are magistrates who are elected. It's representative.
But you can only be elected if you're a wealthy man.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so this executive rule that once belonged to the monarchy was then passed on to a pair of consuls who were elected for 1 year terms, and they were subject to each other's veto. And Julius Caesar was a consul for many, many years. And the consuls remained the highest magistrates throughout the history of the Republic. They had the power to levy and command Rome's armies. They enforced laws. They gave audience to foreign delegations. They presided in the Senate and over the popular assemblies. And originally, patricians were the only class that could enter the Senate, which was an appointed position. And then later in the Republic, some plebeians were able to run and be elected. But for a majority of this time, that governmental body that Julius Caesar and Brutus and Cassius and Cicero and Cato were all a part of was based on being a patrician, being an aristocrat, being a wealthy man. The assassination of Julius Caesar took place, though, in the late Republic. And the social order for the late Republic was as such. We're going to go from the bottom of the tier up to the top. So the late Republic in Rome had a large slave population, and about a third of the population was a slave population. And they worked on latifundiums, or plantations. There was also a mass of free Romans, ex-slaves or descendants of slaves, who were working people who Parenti calls the proletariat. And I know that this idea of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat wasn't really a theoretical framework until much later in time. But for the sake of saying, like, there are people who own and there are people who sell their labor for wages, these are Romans who sold their labor for wages. They didn't own stuff. And these free Romans, they were impoverished and lived in crowded tenements oftentimes. Above the free Romans, that massive free Romans, there was also farmers and small landowners on the outskirts of the city. And then above them, there was the middle class of minor officials, merchants and employers. Above them was the equites, which was a few thousand, what we would consider today multimillionaires. They were state contractors, bankers, traders, tax collectors, and landowners. And then above the equites was the landed aristocrats who populated the Roman Senate, and they invested in business. And for this class, it was more about lineage than wealth, but they were wealthy, they came from noble families, and they were appointed into the Senate.
So you mentioned the equites being sort of like our modern 1% already, and then above that, there's this nobility that, it struck me, the House of Lords in England, in Britain, is doing away with hereditary lordships this year. And that is something that is modeled after this.
Right.
Because as we like to say, right, some things haven't changed and some things go back to BCE.
Yes.
But this sort of like idea of it is noble families, it is families who have been at the top of society for a very long time. And they have resources and money that the majority of, that is even eclipses the 1%, what we would consider like a modern 1%. They're that like 0.01%.
Exactly. And this is the class of Caesar and Brutus and Cassius. Yeah, that's who our conspirators, our assassins are. Well, and then also the assassinated Caesar. And politically, Rome was a republic, but Parenti notes that it was a republic more in form than content, because almost all major political decisions were made by the Senate, this aristocratic, non-elected, as Parenti says, oligarchy. And there were about 600 members of the Senate. They decided foreign policy, they appointed provincial governors, they controlled the purse strings of the republic, they controlled deployment of the military, and by Caesar's rule as consul, there were 3 assemblies within the Senate organized by tribal associations and property qualifications. And within the assemblies, there were these voting units, and there was a voting unit for the proletariat or the working Romans, but the ratio was about 1 working person to about 14 or 20 wealthy aristocrats. So it was very disproportionate representation between the working people of Rome and the aristocrats. And so with all this responsibility for the direction of the Republic, Parenti notes that the rich senators paid no taxes. They lent money to the state on interest that was taxed at home and abroad. And so for these rich senators, there was this upward redistribution of income. So just the setting the stage, like the balance of like the wealth gap is really huge in the late Roman Republic. And not only that, but to be one of the like members of the political landscape in Rome, it was also very difficult for common people to actually participate in that political process because to run for election, you either had to be wealthy or have the support of wealthy backers to buy votes. And candidates rarely represented election programs. So, like when they were running, they rarely were like, here's my program, here's what I stand for. They ran on personal qualities, integrity, leadership, prestige, association with their family and or important people of the day, as well as past public service and war records.
So you can buy a beer with him kind of vibes.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And by the late Roman Republic, even though the Senate was controlled by a concentration of like 20-ish aristocratic families, at a certain point, like down the Republic line, when we get to Julius Caesar, plebeians could accumulate wealth through generational wealth and have the money to run. But there is a disproportionate balance between the patricians and the plebeians.
Mm.
By the second century, so by the time of Tiberius Gracchus, who was a consul before Caesar, the Senate was divided into two groups, like two factions. One of them was the optimates, a larger group considered like the quote, they consider themselves the quote unquote best men, and they were conservatives. They were conservatives interested in expanding their own class interests. And again, this was the larger faction. The other faction was the populares, which was a reformer faction with democratic tendencies who sometimes sided with the common people against the Senate. And again, that was a smaller faction within the Senate. So again, within the Senate, there's the optimates and there are the populares. If something was popular enough during the late Roman Republic, the populares could actually pass measures against the conservative faction, but it wasn't often the case because, you know, there's more of them than there are of us kind of situation.
Yeah.
And historians know that the Senate was a monopoly full of oligarchs not practicing democracy, and yet they have continued to praise this government body is like one of Parenti's big criticisms of this, like, you know, question of who's telling the story, who's recording the history, you know, this gentleman historian who continues to pass down these ideas of the history of this time period.
Yeah, there's certainly a like popular myth of this time period or, you know, the idea of democracy coming from ancient Rome myth that I definitely heard in school when studying this in like ancient Greece of like, oh yeah, this is where democracy comes from.
Does it?
Did it?
Yeah. Yeah. And an example of this that Parenti notes is that, for example, Cicero, who is supportive of the conspirators but is not a conspirator himself, is overall by historians praised as a, quote, champion of liberty who opposed Julius Caesar and who refused to live under a tyranny, unquote. But Parenti says he was a, quote, self-enriching, slaveholder, slumlord, ruling class mouthpiece, executioner, and senatorial oligarch, unquote, rather than being sympathetic to the popularis and the Democrats. And there are some examples of Cicero being like anti-democratic. Cicero opposed the secret ballot because, quote, the secret ballot makes it easier for the common people to act independently and do mischief, unquote. And he also created a witch hunt campaign against reformers in the Senate during his time as consul back in like 63 BCE. And during this witch hunt against the populares, those reformers, he ordered without trial the execution of 5 people he charged with conspiracy against the state. And this is called the Catiline Conspiracy. So, you know, these are interesting instances of the liberators making questionable political decisions and having questionable political ideologies, I suppose. It just makes me question the purpose behind portraying Cicero as a man of liberty, like fighting for liberty.
Mm-hmm. As we mentioned, as we kind of asked earlier, for whom? To what end?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Parenti claims that the greatest popularist leader was Julius Caesar. And due to the course of historians, those gentlemen historians, few of us know of him in this role. But during Caesar's consulships and after the Civil War, that civil war with Pompey that is a really important event that
Precedes the
the
events of the
play,
play. Yeah.
yeah, precedes the events of the play and is super important. During his consulships and after the Civil War, Caesar did a lot of things, a lot of reform. I'm just going to list them. He founded new settlements for veterans of his army and 80,000 of Rome's working people. He distributed some of the best lands near Rome and elsewhere to 20,000 poor families that had 3 or more children. He sent many unemployed working people to repair ancient cities in the colonies or gave them work on public works with Rome. He directed large landholders to have at least 1/3 of their laborers to be free men rather than slaves. And so this compelled payments of wages. So the landholders are being told at least 1/3 of your workers need to actually be paid wages. You can't just have slave labor. So this would have diminished the landowners' profits. And it also reduced unemployment and crime in Rome. And he also remitted a whole year of rent for low to moderate housing. Following Gaius Gracchus and other populares, Caesar increased duties on foreign imports, which one, encouraged domestic industry, and two, made the rich pay the state for their lavish lifestyles. He also attempted to impose honest administration in the provinces. So in the provinces, he capped tax rates. He eliminated within the administration self-enriching middlemen. He ejected from the Senate all associated with provincial plunder. So he was like, draining the swamp without our current contemporary understanding of what that means. That's what he was doing, you know? He also allowed repayment of debts at lower pre-war prices. He abolished fines that were put onto debtors. He ordered the interests people had already paid be applied to reducing the principal they owed. He canceled all debt interests accumulated over several years, erasing 1/4 of all debts. And he abolished individuals' ability to sell themselves into servitude if they were in debt. So this is a policy that favored human sovereignty and said, like, you cannot be property. And so all of these reforms show that Caesar erased the debt burden. And he erased the debt burden not to help the smaller population of aristocrats who profited from a lot of these policies, these debt policies, but to favor the laboring masses who were in debt, who were living in impoverished conditions. Parenti notes that Cicero foresaw these reforms turning into revolution against the ruling class. And it's at this point that Parenti notes the word Caesarism that was mostly used in the 19th century to mean autocracy. But as Parenti had detailed in that long list of reforms that benefited working people, Caesar used his power to benefit the masses. One thing that Caesar said is he said, quote, "I am sated with power and glory. The important thing is to get things done," unquote, as well as to avoid another civil war. So that was what his priorities were as a consul, was like getting things done. And Parenti guesses that Caesar might have eventually democratized the Roman constitution if he had lived. We don't know that for sure, but based on his track record, he wonders if that would have happened. And one reason for guessing this is because after the Civil War, Caesar pardoned the Athenians for siding with Pompey and introduced a democratic constitution for that city. And Caesar also enfranchised the population in the parts of Gaul that he conquered. And he also helped undo Sulla's earlier reactionary legislation that strangulated the previous democratic parts of the Constitution. And Sulla, I learned, was a military leader decades earlier who murdered thousands who were sympathetic to the democratic cause. Yeah, a reactionary who was trying to halt democratic progress. During all of this, Caesar did begin to bypass the Senate and deal only with the assembly. Parenti then continues with more of Caesar's accomplishments as consul. Caesar granted citizenship to all medical practitioners and professors of liberal arts to encourage them to stay in Rome. He set about to provide Rome with fine public libraries. He guaranteed to Jewish people the right to practice their religion. He had the proceedings of the Senate and Assembly published and posted every day to make them accountable to the general public. He regularly disregarded senatorial vetoes. He streamlined the voter registration rolls. After the Civil War, he arranged that half the rolls of the magistrates be popularly elected and the other half appointed by himself. He terminated Cicero's witch hunts against the Democrats, and he sent Cicero into exile. He expanded Senate membership, and he made a small number of the population called Libertini senators. And Libertini was a population of the sons of liberated slaves who rose to distinction after being liberated. And so these legislative decisions made Caesar popular amongst the Roman people, as well as upper middle class people and entrepreneurs. And so Parenti thinks that this was seen as a possible social revolution for the people of Rome. You know, there's this redistribution of wealth amongst the poor at the expense of who?
That 0.1% at the very top.
Yeah. But even though there are all these really great redistribution programs and reforms, Parenti says that Caesar was a reformer, not a social revolutionary, because there are a few things that he did that are not so favorable. He abolished all workers' guilds except for ancient ones, and he didn't eliminate all debt payments. And that was something that was popular amongst the Democrats, was they wanted all debt payments to be eliminated. Caesar also appointed himself dictator in perpetuity. It was originally like a 6-month or a 1-year position, and it was now in perpetuity.
Yeah.
The word dictator meant commander in chief, not dictator, but still it was like he made himself that for forever.
What I did to sort of prepare for this, as we talked about, like my previous understanding was very small, but I listened to a few podcasts about the history of Rome, specifically around this time, just to see what else is out there. And I think it was summed up really well. To do all this stuff, he's also been consolidating power in his efforts to make these social changes. He, as you said, he's getting rid of middlemen. He's changing who can be a magistrate and sort of consolidating power underneath him. And then he named himself dictator in perpetuity, which everything that I kind of listened to was like, and that's maybe the thing that at least looked like a king to the aristocracy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And I do have like a counter that Parenti presents is that like you are right, he is consolidating power. And Parenti wonders if the conspirators were not necessarily concerned with the fact that Caesar had power, but rather how it was being used, i.e., using it to benefit the masses versus using it to benefit the aristocracy.
To benefit them.
Exactly. So, like, if instead of these mass redistribution programs, Caesar was using all of his power to, and even bypassing them, but he was bypassing them to give them more land and more money and more power, would they have been as concerned as they were potentially due to this program and these policies that Caesar was putting in place?
Right. Yeah, I think it's just like a moment where it's like many versions of this story hinge on, and that's when they thought he was going to be a king, and so it was then time to maintain the republic, which is maybe a very nice a gloss over of some additional reasons that there could have been to halt the social changes that were happening.
Yeah, it's like you're kind of reaching up to a certain point of accuracy, but you're not going all the way there or explaining more about the why.
It's missing some context about what Caesar was doing with this power.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And I think it's also right to maybe to suspect that this kind of use of power was seen as unforgivable to the ruling class and to their interests. Because if you think about it, aristocratic freedom is antithetical to popular democracy. So if the aristocracy really wanted liberty, they really wanted freedom, then why would they keep that power, that like freedom?
Why is it a limited resource?
In such a tiny bubble? Exactly.
Yeah.
But Julius Caesar was not the only popularist leader. There was also Tiberius Gracchus, who contributed land reform, and Tiberius Gracchus was also assassinated, as was Tiberius Gracchus's brother, Gaius Gracchus, who also was a popularis, also was assassinated. And Parenti notes that most of the 10 or 12 popularist leaders were assassinated, or they had untimely deaths under mysterious circumstances. So these are all leaders between 133 to 44 BCE, popularis reformers. I wonder what happened. Why did they die?
All within like the same 100-year time span?
Suspicious. And Parenti puts forth that the reason why all of these leaders were assassinated or saw untimely mysterious deaths is because they challenged the aristocratic oligarchic system. And gentleman historians also validate the assassinations. Like, you know, this question of like, oh, was it right to do it? And then we have gentleman historians who continue to tell stories about the assassinations and like validate them. There's one historian, Howard Hayes Scollard, who is a famous British historian of antiquity, who described Tiberius Gracchus's assassination as, quote, the prudent senators were forced to confront the overzealous reformer. The urban mob that thronged the assembly in Rome was becoming increasingly irresponsible. Tiberius was threatening to turn the tribunes into agents of the popular will. This would have given the assembly greater responsibility than it could properly wield. Unquote.
Yeah, that seems very much like an aristocratic person justifying the consolidation of power with aristocratic people and shouting down reforms in his own time.
Yeah, Scollard lived from 1903 to 1983. So, one of the reasons why there is this kind of justification for the assassination of these popularist leaders like Caesar is the accusation that these leaders are self-promoting adventurers. But then there's also this like policy record that these leaders were also advancing mass well-being. And so it's like, which one is it? And Parenti thinks that it's like more nuanced than that. Like these leaders wanted to A, pursue policy that benefits the masses, B, win mass support, and they also might C, enjoy the personal gratification and glory of this popularity. So this accusation of Caesar, you know, letting things get to his head or really relishing in,
Hmm.
I'm trying to think of the exact kind of examples or reasonings that were given by the conspirators.
Well, it's like the things that like Cassius says about him of like he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men peek out from under him to find ourselves dishonorable graves. And like, is he grown so
Thank
great?
you.
You're welcome. uh,
Hmm.
and Cassius also says to Brutus, like he reminds Brutus of Brutus's ancestor who helped overthrow the last king of Rome prior to the Republic, and says, there was a Brutus once who like would have left Rome rather than live under a king. So there's a lot of like, the people are giving Caesar, they're celebrating Caesar, and like look at him love it. Look at him love like dealing with the common people.
Oh, how horrible for common people to like you. Wow.
Yeah.
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 And this is a great time for me to move in and talk about some of the forces in ancient Rome besides, like we've talked about Caesar, we've talked about the consul, we've talked about the Senate. There also is the force in Rome, in ancient Rome, of the working people, the proletariat. And I want to take a moment to lay out some of the instances that we have of the working people, the common people of ancient Rome participating in like the political life of what was happening in the late Roman Republic leading up to and even beyond Caesar's assassination, because I think it's important to also bring up this population. Oftentimes, bourgeois historians or those gentlemen historians claim that the working people had no role in bringing about democracy in ancient Rome. And Parenti points out that in Plutarch specifically, there are instances in which it's reported that the working people were participating and making their voices known. So in 82 BCE, the common people resisted the reactionary Sulla's army. So remember, Sulla was that military commander that issued a mass slaughter of like thousands of people or something like that. And so the common people resisted Sulla's army entering the city of Rome, and they stopped the soldiers by throwing stones and setting up a barrage. And this is important because Sulla was bringing in his soldiers into Rome to commit a massacre, which was a crime. And so this is an instance of like the common people actually participating in stopping the atrocities. In 50 BCE, the people supported Caesar as he crossed the Rubicon returning to Rome. And this act was in defiance of the senators who commanded Caesar disband his army when he returned to Rome. And Parenti contextualized this event because it was hard for me to really understand what exactly was the context by just looking at like Wikipedia is not the best resource, my friends. But I was trying to see what was being said about this. And Parenti contextualized this crossing the Rubicon. And before Caesar returned to Rome, he learned from a German king that Caesar had enemies in Rome, plotting with the Germans to get Caesar killed. And so when Caesar was coming back to Rome, in order to enter Rome, he was told to leave his army, but he was told to leave his army after finding out from a German king that there were people, enemies in Rome
Who are
plotting
trying.
to kill him. Yeah.
Yeah. hey, leave your people.
Yeah.
Why don't you leave your crew on like outside, and why don't
Outside.
you come in here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, if this was true, why would Caesar enter Rome to find his enemies without having an army? But when he was crossing the Rubicon, he had support from the people. And then in 48 BCE, the people also agitated when oligarchic magistrates tried to obstruct Caesar's debt relief law. So they liked the debt relief law. They did not want it to go away. And so they were vocal about their support for this law remaining. It was important enough to them that they probably took to the streets and protested. And then after the Civil War, that civil war between Pompey and Caesar, the city crowds pulled down and smashed the statues of Pompey and Sulla because they supported Caesar. And so Parenti brings these incidents up because there is very little record keeping about the lives of the common people. And these are indications of what was happening within the working class of the late Republic. And like I said, these passages were from Plutarch, and they have mostly been ignored by historians. And they're not really incorporated into Shakespeare's play very much either. Like the common people are involved, but they're very like, they're mobs, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So there's this kind of lack of seriousness with which I think historians and even Shakespeare's play take the working people of Rome as actual agents of the political process, which is very different from Coriolanus. In the first scene of Coriolanus, you know, the common people have this really compelling argument against the grain situation in Rome
Mm-hmm.
and against the political structure. And then they get the tribunes.
Yeah.
And Parenti also points out that it's not just the gentleman historians from post ancient Rome. It's also like aristocratic historians and poets from the late Roman Republic or the Roman Republic in general who also have this aristocratic perspective. They are part of that aristocratic class, and their storytelling about the people of Rome, the working people, describes them as mobs and violent and a problem for the integrity of Rome and the Republic. And notably, there's this early Roman Republic poet named Juvenal who spoke of the preoccupation with bread and circuses. And this is a phrase that is still used today to refer to superficial appeasements to like the
Mm-hmm.
working class, the poor, and it's quite condescending. And one thing I find really interesting about Parenti's research is his commentary on Plutarch, the storyteller. Because The Life of Caesar by Plutarch is Shakespeare's like most primary resource. We've talked about how it's not his only source, but it is his primary source. And while Parenti has classified many of the cast of characters as aristocratic oligarchs, you know, Cicero, Brutus, Cassius, even Caesar, who is a popularis, but is still a part of that class. Plutarch, even though he is still telling an aristocratic story, he is still sympathetic to, or at least writes sympathetically about the common people and acknowledges that in his storytelling. Plutarch writes, quote, "It was above all the people themselves who did most to arouse Tiberius's energy and ambitions by inscribing slogans and appeals on porticos, monuments, and the walls of houses, calling upon him to recover the public land for the poor," unquote. So they advocated for themselves, calling upon him, Tiberius Gracchus, that first popularis I mentioned, who did a lot of reform and was assassinated, to recover land for the poor. Also, when Gaius Gracchus, his brother, the other popularis who was assassinated, put forth his reform legislation, quote, "A great multitude began to gather in Rome from all parts of Italy to support him," unquote. And Parenti notes that a great many people coming from all parts of Italy at a day and age with no airplanes, no trains, no buses, no cars is quite a dedication to being an agent of political change and speaking your mind to support this legislation. And when the Gracchi were assassinated, public acknowledgement of the two popularis were prohibited by the Senate oligarchs. But Plutarch shows how much the people missed the Gracchi brothers when statues of the brothers were set up in a prominent part of the city with offerings. And so Parenti points out that in this particular story of the Senate outlawing acknowledgement and respects being paid to the Gracchi brothers, In a way, the Senate is controlling historical memory by not allowing the people to put up a statue and provide offerings and remember the popularist leaders who they supported. And in 44 BCE, after Caesar's assassination, the people agitated for a guarantee that Caesar's land redistribution plan would not be rolled back. And this compelled Brutus to calm the crowd and promise it would remain. So, yeah, they're protesting. They're saying, we like this reform. You can't get rid of it. And so Brutus is listening to them because if they hadn't said anything about it, he probably would have rolled it back. Brutus is also a key conspirator in the assassination. And we think a lot from Shakespeare's play about, is Brutus an honorable man? And also, is he the most noble Roman? Parenti notes that, like, yes, he was a key conspirator in the assassination, and Julius Caesar loved Brutus. But maybe Julius Caesar loved Brutus because this was like hot tea that I did not know. Brutus's mom was also Caesar's mistress.
Yes, I learned this hot tea too during my research. And I was like, and actually multiple sources that I listened to commented on this hot tea of Julius Caesar was rumored to be in a relationship with Brutus's mom. One of the podcasts I listened to did note that Caesar would have been 15 when this happened. However, also noted Romans started early, I believe is a quote in trying to speak about what rumor has it was said when Caesar died, which is very much likely apocryphal, historians believe, thing that Caesar says when he dies, which in Shakespeare is et tu Brute, and you Brutus, then fall Caesar. But in another version of this myth of Caesar saying something as he dies, which again, like historians now, all my sources said was they believed that like no, he maybe grunted while he was fighting for his life, but he was being stabbed. Like he did. Is Greek for "and you, child," which could be two things. Legend had it that he said this in Greek, which is the kind of like the Roman version of English speakers speaking in French to be fancy. He said it in Greek. It could be both like, and you was kind of also like a curse, not just like, and you, Brutus, like I recognize you, but like what you have done to me will come to you was sort of like
karma
sense. So there's one version of that of like karma, young one, but then there's also this option of Julius Caesar acknowledging, being like, yeah, the rumors are true. I'm your dad.
If true, that would be hot tea.
Very hot tea.
That's some hot late Roman Republic tea. Yeah.
Yes.
Parenti's not convinced that that's true, but it is apocryphal. And like, it sounds, honestly, I feel like it would make more sense.
Hilarious.
Yeah, hilarious.
You're stabbing me and I'm just going to chirp you and be like, I did your mom. Yeah.
It's like Aaron, you've undone our mother. Yeah. No, I've done your mother or whatever. It's up there.
Yeah.
The thing that Parenti mentions about Brutus is questioning whether or not he's noble, honorable. The noble Brutus was a usurer who lent money to the Cypriots, who were inhabitants of Cyprus, at 48% interest, and 12% was the traditional rate of usury.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's some predatory loan sharking.
Absolutely. And then he requested the Roman military help him and his agents extract the money owed by the Cypriots when they couldn't pay back the 48% loan. So if Caesar is basically abolishing or rolling back or capping debt situations.
Ooh, that's a major threat to Brutus's business.
Absolutely. In addition to Brutus, Cato is always described as principled, but he also used bribes in elections as a quote-unquote necessity. And Cato opposed Caesar's democratic reforms. So these central characters in late Roman Republic, the main conspirator
had some motives outside of, like I mentioned, like the semi-common theme of he was consolidating power, he was becoming a king, he was, dating Cleopatra and they had a kid together, and if he had a kid with a queen, then what if he became a king and then his son was his heir? These are the sort of like things that are said about Caesar's behavior that do not involve like actual like livelihood. It's way more just like salacious gossip. Oh, let's just kill him because we think that he's getting too big for yeah.
Yeah. But in fact, he might be a literal, actual, tangible threat to the livelihoods of of the 1%. What did we say? The
Point one.
0.001%? The point one, yeah.
Point
The
zero zero one. It
0.1%.
keeps getting
Yeah.
smaller every time we talk
Yeah.
about it. Uh,
Well, as Brutus keeps raising that interest rate, I mean, but yeah, it's a threat to the 0.1% of the late Roman Republic.
R.I.P. Brutus, you would have loved payday loans.
True. Accurate. And so that leads us to the assassination. The conspiracy, if we are to believe Plutarch, was hatched when Caius Cassius approached his brother-in-law, Marcus Brutus, and asked him to join the undertaking. Cassius and Brutus fought under Pompey in the Civil War, so they were in the faction against Caesar, and were pardoned by Caesar after the Civil War. Caesar did have a fondness for Brutus, and during the civil war at Pharsalus, Caesar commanded Brutus not be slain in fighting and be taken alive. And if Brutus resisted capture, he were to be let go without violence. And Parenti suspects that this was on behalf of Caesar's love for Brutus's mother, Servilia, who was one of his lovers, and maybe his great love. I think Parenti says that Servilia is one of Caesar's great loves. There were about 60 conspirators in total. Most of them were high-ranking Romans, and there were a few strategies that the conspirators planned. Number one, to push him off a wooden bridge used by voters going to the poll, and there would be conspirators below that would have their knives drawn for his fall, ready to stab him. Number two, yeah, stab, stab.
Up, up.
Yeah, yeah.
When he falls on us.
Yeah. Great thinking, guys. Yeah, they're class. They're class, aren't they? The second strategy was to kill him en route during a public ceremony, but Caesar was expected to leave for a military campaign on March 18th, and so the conspirators chose to attack on March 15th, when Caesar was to meet the Senate in a hall adjacent from the theater of Pompey. And the conspirators considered their act tyrannicide, a righteous act in ancient Rome and Greece. They didn't think it was treason, and they expected it to be seen by the general public favorably. But due to the class struggle that we discussed earlier, this whole, evidence of all the reforms and how popular Caesar was because of the reforms and how unpopular he was to the Senate because of the
The
reforms.
reforms.
Parenti quotes Major General Fuller's biography of Caesar, quote, "Blinded by their arrogance and corrupted by their avarice, they overlooked the causes of the struggle and persuaded themselves that, were Caesar removed, the Republican machinery would at once begin to function." Unquote. So they were blinded by their own interests and didn't realize that he's popular for a reason. It would cause a stir.
Again, most of my listening also credited this as like a major downfall of like they had no idea how unpopular this choice would be. They were that out of touch with the common people. Yeah.
So out of touch. And some conspirators also wanted to kill Mark Antony and Lepidus, but Brutus thought killing all three of them would look like a partisan coup by the Pompey faction, and so they only killed Caesar. The conspirators also carried out the mission themselves rather than hiring assassins, which I think I've never really thought about that they carried it out themselves. They weren't like Macbeth, who hired assassins to get rid of his enemies. And this could be because maybe they thought it was an honorable mission of tyrannicide, and everyone else would be like, ah, yes, this is a glorious act that they did.
I think that's what they, based on like, again, the versions of the story that I listened to, were all like, yeah, they really thought they were going to be fine. They really did not think about what happened after.
Parenti goes on to detail Plutarch's account of the day of the assassination. On March 15th, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar died at the age of 56. And following Caesar's assassination, Parenti says, there was opposition to Caesar, the quote-unquote tyrant, but Parenti is skeptical about the dissent and wonders if the opposition and the songs and the posters were actually fashioned by hired clientele of Caesar's enemies. And he wonders if these songs and posters and these claims of disapproval were more of an instigation than a symptom of popular disaffection to get people to go, oh, yeah, people really were upset with Caesar. And the reason why he questions and is skeptical about this opposition to Caesar is because if Caesar was intensely hated as a usurper, it was not by most. Parenti notes that while the plebs overwhelmingly opposed a kingship for him, they still supported much else he had done or was trying to do, including the very policies that moved the assassins toward their deed. Quote, the perpetrators correctly understood that the people were averse to monarchy. From this, they incorrectly concluded that the people saw Caesar as the worst of knightly tyrants, unquote. So what Parenti is arguing is that, like, that thing that we talked about, how maybe the dictator in perpetuity is coming potentially like symbolically or even politically closer to a kingship. The people didn't want a king, but they didn't actually view Caesar as a
They may not have
tyrant
seen Caesar.
because
Yeah. He was giving them lots of things.
reforms, lots
Yeah.
of things.
And they could have seen it as like, we'll deal with him if he becomes a true tyrant when it gets to that, but let's give him a chance to maybe he just needs to do this temporary as long as he needs it instead of for 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
Which is also it is said in which is said in Shakespeare of like I think it's Antony does speak to like so they said that he was a tyrant. Did we really see that? Or did, he didn't get the chance to prove that he would do this. You assassinated
Yeah,
him based on what you thought he would do.
exactly. And so the kind of evidence that exists doesn't really show and again, like the common people are the majority of Romans.
Mm-hmm.
The aristocracy is a very tiny portion of Romans. So, the common people of Rome were not a monolith, but based on some of these instances that are laid out in Plutarch, maybe this opposition is a small group of people who fear losing their own interests, their own
Mm-hmm.
lifestyle. And maybe this question of the dictator in perpetuity wouldn't have been a long-standing, you know, if Rome is to actually become a democracy, there wouldn't be the need for a dictator in perpetuity. So,
Yeah. You might decide that that's the way you're going to do what you need to do to create the democracy as he did, as you mentioned, he did in Gaul and Athens, other places that he conquered.
yeah, means to an end.
Yeah. We'll never know.
Rome did not get the chance to know. And following the assassination, the civilian population also demanded Caesar's reforms not be rolled back. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Well, and this is in contrast, really, because like there were elites like Cicero who recommended keeping Caesar's reforms as a call for peace and unity, while also privately writing to Atticus, quote, "Is it not lamentable that we should be upholding the very things that made us hate Caesar?" Unquote. Yeah. Yeah. So the senators did decide to retain Caesar's reforms and give Caesar a state funeral and spared the lives of the assassins, but it wasn't done out of the goodness of their own heart. It was done out of the political pressure of the people. And the populace was upset by the assassination, and they, according to gentlemen historians, quote unquote, rioted. Cicero suggested to Brutus and Cassius that following the assassination, those two leave Italy, and both Brutus and Cassius did leave Italy a few weeks after the Ides of March. But, rioting as language might be the way that the gentleman historians are describing the populace. The public did mourn Caesar's death by throwing whatever they could get a hold of, benches, amulets, decorations, laurels, anything flammable, into the pyre of Caesar's burial, his funeral, because they wanted to keep the fire burning.
Wow.
Yeah. And what followed for Rome was a civil war called the quote unquote Liberators' Civil War that took place from 43 to 42 BCE. And it was between two factions, Mark Antony and Octavius, the Second Triumvirate, and Brutus and Cassius, the Liberatores. And this is what we see take place in Shakespeare's play. And then Parenti also notes that at the end of the late Roman Republic, things do roll back. Democracy does roll back in Rome. I didn't research the exact rollbacks of democratic governance,
Mm-hmm.
so I can't speak to that. But what was the assassination for, you know?
Yeah.
So in the case of the conspirators, to conclude, it might not have been about freedom and more about their own economic interests and the interests of being a member of that very elite class and the threat of expanding democracy and what that will do to your class and your class interests. But if you are fighting for democracy as a result of that fight for expanding democracy against the wishes of the ruling class, you might end up being labeled a tyrant or a mob. And as we continue to explore Julius Caesar and think about Caesar and Brutus and Cassius and the conspirators, as well as the people of the play, like the common people, I just think that this context is really important for questioning who tells our stories and what that does, you know, when fiction becomes fact and when the victors or the aristocrats dominate storytelling and how that, I don't know, how that shapes our understanding of the world when there are more perspectives and there are more ways to examine these moments in time if we, I don't know, if we dig hard enough. And that's my reading.
That was great. I appreciate it. And I feel like it's very in line with a lot of what we talk about here, which is, how do we get into like the human beings who are behind Shakespeare and the world and broaden the, sometimes narrow vision that we have. I also think that like this, you mentioned that, this is a few decades old, this analysis. And when you took on the bulk of this, I was like, well, I want to do a little something. And I said, I will go search podcasts to see how are, other history podcasts talking about this. And I was pleasantly surprised, but I do want to give a shout out to the History of Rome podcast and to History This Week's Barry Strauss, who I think has, benefited from the work that Parenti did to open the lens of history up to include more than just the gentleman historians. Mm-hmm. So now, the question that we often ask especially when we do these episodes that have a lot more to do with like the history or something that's additional context. What do we do with this play when we look back at the play that Shakespeare wrote? And there are some interesting things that I'll just briefly mention. You mentioned briefly that like Shakespeare does stick to Plutarch pretty closely. And there are things that you were talking about, like Caesar's reforms, that I was like, oh, that's Mark Antony shows the will.
Right.
And the will specifically enumerates that people are getting money.
Yes.
And people are getting private walks and gardens, like land, for their recreation.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, that's Shakespeare writing in references to the reforms and to things that these people wanted to keep.
Mm-hmm.
And then Mark Antony did, in fact, rile up the crowd, although it was, Strauss noted that it was a little bit more like a cheerleader, being like, Julius Caesar did this, and Julius Caesar did that. And Shakespeare's Mark Antony is a little bit more political in how he maneuvers that situation. But Mark Antony also presented a wax figure of Caesar's body with the wounds. Those are just a couple things that I was like, oh, like Shakespeare does weave in, as we mentioned earlier, a very politically neutral version of events, as he needed to during his time period. Mm-hmm. And I think that there are a couple things that came to my mind when I was thinking about like how do theater makers or educators take this now? Something that immediately came to my mind was, wow, knowing all of this would really help understand the motivations of the plebeians in Shakespeare's play. Why are they so angry? It's not just that it can be a little bit more than just they're an easily swayed mob. It can be, no, once they're reminded of the things that they stand to lose that Caesar did for them, that's why they're as upset.
Mm-hmm.
And why they go to the extreme of killing Cinna the poet. Which, that's another thing that did actually happen. To me, it would feel like it would be really helpful potentially for actors to understand what does that will actually mean. And the other thing that has come to my mind is that you'll sometimes see productions that really try to bumper sticker on top of this play some modern real life politics. Mm-hmm. And I think that we've already talked about the problems inherent in that is that this play's message about assassination is ultimately like, maybe don't do assassination. It might not end up the way you think it does.
Mm-hmm.
And that's maybe the like hottest take that Shakespeare takes. But yet you'll sometimes see this like bumper sticker, like real people fan fiction version. And to me, I was like, oh, for me at least, this makes an even stronger case of like, you can't just put
Against it.
any
Yeah.
modern politician on top of this play and be like, maybe don't assassinate them. This is a play that's very much the story of Julius Caesar, or if you're going to modernize it, just make it very ambiguous as to, like, don't tie it to a real person, because it's not going to say what you think it does.
Yeah, I feel that. I feel that. The ambiguity of the text of Shakespeare's play makes it really hard because if you have a strong message to make, you're going to cancel out your message or it's going to backfire.
Much like the conspirators.
Much like the conspirators. Yeah.
I also think that, like, it could be helpful for actors specifically with understanding, like, Mark Antony and Cassius and Brutus and, giving them more options to play with, understanding who these people were.
Yeah. Yeah. Motivations, like having motivations that are very strong. And I don't know about you, but I feel like our material reality influences a lot of our choices.
Mm-hmm.
So that could give especially with language that is quite vague. And so maybe in understanding this social world, this political world, it can then be much more specific for certain characters to know, like, oh, they are pissed off at Caesar for a reason that's nefarious versus it's
Mm-hmm.
out of good faith, you know?
Yeah.
Because Shakespeare's language about why they assassinate Caesar is super vague.
Mm-hmm.
And so stepping in and trying to figure out what does it mean? Mark Antony has like the most specific things to say about Julius Caesar, but the conspirators are like quite vague.
Yeah.
Their reasoning is not sound to me. So I think that gives actors the ability to really root themselves in something very real versus a kind of ideological conundrum.
Yeah. And with that, thank you for listening. And if you liked this episode, please feel free to rate and review wherever you are listening to your podcasts.
I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Neverending Minute by Sounds Like Sander.
If you would like to support us, visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. You can also hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it. For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, or follow us on Instagram at shakespeareanyonepod.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here is a completely random Shakespeare quote for you. From The Tempest, Act 4, Scene 1, said by Prospero. I, with a twink.